After letting all the oil drain out of the oil pan, I put the oil pan plug back on with a 17mm wrench and snugged it up. And you want to slide your catch pan out of the way. Now comes the dangerous and very scary part of this whole operation is you're going to have to take the engine off the motor mounts right there. It's only one nut, and you're going to have to drop that down in order to get the subframe out of there and give yourself enough clearance if you're going to do the oil pan gasket the easy way. So you're going to have to loosen those two up on either side. And just remember, whatever you do, do not start to loosen up the subframe. If you were to loosen up the subframe right now, the entire motor will crush you and fall on top of you. What you then want to do is either get an engine support bar and hoist the engine up by the top, or you can do what I did and take a block of 2x4 on a jack and just jack up the engine underneath the AC compressor. You want to make sure that you have a good, strong jacking point, because if this falls or fails, the engine's coming down on top of you. I was pretty happy with the way that the engine was supported on the floor jack, so then I just left the jack there for the rest of the time. It kind of got in the way and was a little bit cumbersome, and I would have liked an engine support bar, but then again, I didn't have one in access to me, so I had to do with what I had. With the engine properly supported either by jack or by hoist, now you can take down the subframe. It's held on by four 17mm bolts, the longer ones being in the front due to the fact that they have a collar that locks itself into the chassis of the car. Now, if you go to take down the last bolt, it's going to give you a sudden thud and drop of the subframe. What you actually want to do is support it with another jack or jack stands, so when it comes down, it's not so violent like it did here with mine. There will be some prying required, mainly because the subframe has probably never been taken out of this car like this, but once it comes out, it kind of just fell to the floor.
Well, that's one way to do it.
And the good news is the subframe is now out of the car with the control arms. So I just kind of put it aside, and this is kind of what it looks like after 27 years of use. So I'm pretty happy with the way it came out, and the process in which it came out was pretty quick. And this is where it all went wrong. You can see that tab is present there, and the tab there is gone. Somewhere on the road, I don't know where, but must have left it behind. Anyway, so that's out. The good news is I have the new subframe lined up and ready to be swapped over. Now it's time to go back to the steering rack, and you're going to have to pull this knuckle off of the steering shaft of the car by loosening up that bolt and nut, which are both 13mm, and prying it away from the cabin of the car. And with it out, you want to set it aside on your workbench. The next big job I tackled was the oil pan gasket. Unfortunately, these gaskets don't last very long. They only have a lifespan of about 5 years. But anyway, I might as well do it while I'm here. So I began by loosening up the dampening bar that attaches itself to the transmission, and that's to prevent when the transmission gives a little bit and when you go over a heavy bump, it doesn't make a loud clanking noise on the subframe. It's got a little rubber bushing there, and it's held on by two 13mm bolts. With that out of the way, we can now begin by taking down the transmission dust shield that is held on by 8mm inverted Torx heads. Now, if you don't have an inverted Torx socket, you can use an 8mm socket or a 6.8mm socket to take them out. Either way, you can take them out, and this is a part where you want to be extra careful not to strip them or break the bolts. There are 4 inverted Torx heads, one there, and one there. The other one is all the way left of the first bolt that I showed you, and you just have to look a little bit up, and it's right there. And the way you know you got all the 4 bolts out is they're all the same size, and all the same thread, and all the same thread pitch. So they're easily identifiable. With the 4 inverted Torx bolts out, you can now take out the dust shield. It's held on by 4 13mm bolts, which are taken out with a quarter drive socket. When you're done with that, the whole shield will just drop down, exposing extra bolts that attach themselves to the oil pan. They're right there. Now here comes the fun part. You now have to take down all those little bolts holding the oil pan to the block of the engine. Some of them may be a little hard to take out. Don't force them, and this is definitely not a place to break or snap a bolt. However, they do come out, and once you have them all out, you want to lay them out on a paper towel. With all the little nuts and bolts removed from the oil pan, you now want to take down the engine ground strap as well as the oil level sending unit. These are all held on by 10mm nuts and bolts, and once you have those out, you want to lay them out on the paper towel with the other bolts that you took out of the oil pan. Now you can push the oil level sending unit out of the way as well as the ground strap. And I let one of the bolts hang around into the oil pan because I don't want the pan to suddenly drop on top of me. Once I removed that one, I was now able to completely pull down the oil pan. And that's what it looks like. I then thoroughly cleaned both mating surfaces of the engine block and the oil pan, and then I laid down Permatex number 2. Actually, this is the incorrect thing to do. Do not put any Permatex, RTV sealer, any of that kind of sealer on the oil pan, because when I pulled the oil pan back down, it did not make a good seal. Again, do not do this. This is one thing I can stress to you when you do an oil pan gasket. Do not put this kind of stuff on it. It does not work, and it does not make the right kind of seal. And I only created more work for myself because I then had to pull it back down and scrape all this gummy, gooey Permatex number 2 stuff back off the engine and oil pan. Again, I can not stress this enough. Do not load it up with Permatex or any of that stuff. Use the original gasket or use a cork or paper one. Do not put Permatex on it. And it's time to scrape all this work that I just did back off. And now I had to scrape all this off the engine, which is the original gasket as well as RTV sealant put on by the previous owner. It's also a smart idea to clean every single bolt and nut that came off with the oil pan. It only makes it that much easier to install it and make it look a little bit cleaner. So I scraped all the old sealant back off the oil pan as well as the engine block. And I was very particular with my process and making sure that both mating surfaces are 100% clean and clear of any other old gasket or sealant because that would result in most likely a leak. Anyway, so I cleaned up both surfaces and now it's time to install the gasket. So I got out my gasket and I went with a Payne cork oil pan gasket made for the M20B25 engine. And a lot of people say, oh, don't use cork or use paper, or don't use paper, use cork. And I went with the cork one, and as of 10 days, right now I have no leaks. So anyway, I took the gasket out, and then I pulled the oil pan from underneath the car, laid that out on the workbench, and tried to make it as even as possible, so try to make it easier for me to lay down the gasket. Then I got my tub of heavy-duty wheel bearing grease out and put a little tiny glob on my finger. You really don't need a lot of this stuff, and all I did was put it in a couple little spots around the oil pan. Now when I put the gasket back on, if I were to not have this, it would slide around and would probably drive me crazy trying to put in the bolt and possibly damage the gasket. So what I did was just put a little bit on some areas of the oil pan to let the gasket tack on and prevent it from sliding around when I put it up. Now I got the gasket out and made sure that it's facing the correct way and let it sit down on top of the oil pan. And you just have to play with it a little bit, make sure it tacks and lines up perfectly with all the holes. And once it does, you're good to go. It took me a couple tries to get it 100% lined up, but when I did, I pushed it very, very hard up against the engine and let it sit there in place. Then I had a little bolt handy next to me, so all I did was just make sure that it lines up and start to thread in the bolt on either side. You can have a couple bolts next to you, and I would highly recommend this because it makes it a lot easier and you no longer have to push up onto the oil pan to get all the bolts in. With the oil pan freely suspended by itself, I then ran around the oil pan and finger tightened every single one of the bolts. Again, you want to make sure you finger tighten them and not torque them down yet, because even torque is the best kind of torque when it comes to the oil pan gasket. I know that sounds weird, and I will explain it in just a second. So when you torque down the bolts on the oil pan, you have to check what kind of bolts you have, because there's two different kinds. If your bolt is marked with an 8.8, that means that the torque is 89 inch-pounds. If it's marked with a 10.9, it's 109 inch-pounds. You can check it again on the internet, but I believe that's what the Haynes manual says. And again, that's inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. So an inch-pound torque wrench is very tiny. It's a quarter drive one. I bought mine from Harbor Freight, and it's worked phenomenally for me for all the uses that I've needed it for. And so you can see here, I begin by torquing the center. And what you basically want to do is torque from the center out. Uh, say on a head gasket or head bolts or any of those, you would torque in a circular pattern. However, in this case, you want to torque them from the center out. And if it feels like you're going to break a bolt or you start stripping the threads or you're going to start cross-threading it, back out immediately and try to redo the threads. Don't go ahead and try to torque it down with that. And you can hear my torque wrench is clicking there. It's going to feel like you're going to snap the bolt, and I'm sure in the stress tests at the BMW factory back in the 80s, I'm sure some engineers designed it that way. So yeah, you're going to feel like you're going to snap the bolt right in half, but believe me, you won't. You have to throw a lot of torque at these to snap them. Now that the oil pan is properly torqued down, all that's left is to put in all the suspension components. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about the steering rack, modifying the steering knuckle, as well as setting in everything and seating the motor mounts back into the subframe. Thank you for watching E30 Source, and watch part 3.